There are wounds that bleed openly, and wounds that rot in silence. And Eleanor Ashworth had learned to live with the second kind. She stood at the narrow window of her small bedchamber, watching rain crawl down the glass in thin silver lines, each drop racing the next toward the sill. It felt right that the sky should weep today. 3 years had passed since the midsummer ball, yet the memory still lived in her bones, sharp and cold. 3 years since Frederick Weston's voice had cut through her with practiced cruelty, spoken loud enough for the room to hear, and polite enough to ruin her without consequence. Her reflection stared back at her from the rain-darkened glass. Chestnut hair pinned neatly at her neck, one stubborn curl loose near her left temple, amber eyes dulled by disappointment rather than age. She touched the small crescent scar at her brow, a habit she could never break when pain stirred, and straightened her spine. Dignity was the last thing she owned outright, and she guarded it fiercely. The townhouse behind her was quiet in the way of places that had learned to expect less. Once respectable, now merely surviving, it sat in an unfashionable part of New York, where gentle families pretended not to notice their own decline. Eleanor had watched their world shrink year by year, room by room, until this chamber felt less like shelter, and more like a cage. Her father's voice drifted up from below, soft and apologetic. She closed her eyes once, then turned from the window and went to him. Thomas Ashworth sat at the parlour table with papers spread before him, his shoulders bowed under a weight Eleanor knew too well. When he looked up, his eyes held the quiet misery of a man who believed he had failed his child. "I have failed you," he said. "Your mother would have been ashamed." Eleanor crossed the room and took his hands, worn and trembling. She spoke gently, telling him they would manage as they always had. But when he told her the truth, that they had 6 months at most, before the house would be sold, before the last scraps of their former life vanished, something inside her tightened painfully. Later, alone again, memory crept in like an unwanted guest, Frederick's golden hair, his charming smile, the rose silk gown she had saved for months to buy. The moment he announced his engagement to another woman while Eleanor stood close enough to hear his breath, and worst of all his words, delivered with a smile. "You were pleasant enough for a diversion, Miss Ashworth, but hardly wife material for a man of ambition." She pressed her fingers together until they ached and forced the tears back. She had survived this. She would survive whatever came next. 3 days later the knock came. It cut through the quiet afternoon like a blade. Eleanor was mending an old gown, her needle moving with careful economy, when the housekeeper appeared, carrying a silver tray that had not been used in years. Upon it lay a letter of thick cream paper sealed in dark wax, with an unfamiliar crest. Her father broke the seal, his face changing as he read. Confusion, disbelief. Then something like awe. "The Duke of Ashford," he said slowly, "requests permission to call upon Miss Ashworth regarding a matter of mutual benefit." Eleanor felt the words rather than understood them. She had seen the Duke once, years ago, standing apart at a crowded ball, tall and remote, his grey eyes cold and unreadable. A man spoken of in whispers, feared and respected in equal measure. Why would such a man seek her? She agreed to receive him because she had no choice. Hope, she told herself, was a luxury she could not afford. When the carriage arrived, she stood in her best dress, dove grey, and carefully pressed, knowing it would look poor beside his wealth. The door opened, and the Duke filled the room with his presence alone. He was taller than she remembered, broad-shouldered, his movements precise and controlled. His grey eyes swept the room, then settled on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I will be direct," he said. "I require a wife. I offer security and respect. I do not offer love." The honesty should have wounded her. Instead it steadied her. She asked for time. He agreed. When he left, his scent lingered, cedar and leather, and Eleanor pressed her fingers together, reminding herself of the promise forming in her heart. She would not love him. The wedding followed quickly, quiet and efficient. No romance, no celebration, only vows spoken with careful control. When the carriage carried her away from her old life toward Ashford Hall, Eleanor felt the promise waver. The estate rose before her like a living thing, vast and imposing. Inside, marble floors and watching portraits made her feel painfully small. A sharp-eyed woman greeted her with blunt assessment and sharper wit. "There is steel in you," Lady Augusta Blackwell said. "You will need it." Dinner was an ordeal. Later, lost in the halls, Eleanor found a glass conservatory filled with rainlight and green life. There, for the first time, she breathed freely. "You may use this room whenever you wish," the Duke said from behind her. "You need not perform here." It was the first kindness he offered without duty attached. Days passed. Eleanor learned. She managed. The staff obeyed her because he had commanded it. Slowly, she began to see cracks in the fortress he wore. She saw him kneel in the dirt, to comfort a crying child. She saw him laugh when a swan stole her pencil in the garden. She saw tenderness he never spoke aloud. At night, she lay awake, reminding herself of her vow, even as her body betrayed her. Then came the assembly. The gown he chose for her made her feel seen. The pearl bracelet he fastened at her wrist had belonged to his mother. His touch lingered. His breath caught when he looked at her. At the assembly hall, she felt the past reach for her again. Frederick Weston stood across the room, watching her with poison in his smile. He approached, words sharp and polished, meant to remind her of who she had been. Eleanor froze, the old wound tearing open. Then the Duke stepped forward. His voice was ice, his presence unyielding. "My wife is the finest woman in this room," he said. "You will not address her again." The room fell silent. Frederick retreated. Later, in the carriage, the Duke held her hand in the dark, his thumb tracing slow circles against her palm. Eleanor trembled, not with fear, but with the terrifying truth rising in her chest. She was breaking her promise. And she did not know if she could survive what loving him might cost. The days after the county assembly passed in a strange, restless quiet. Eleanor moved through Ashford Hall with a new awareness, as if every corridor remembered what had happened, as if the walls themselves watched her with knowing eyes. She felt changed in ways she could not yet name. The past no longer pressed against her chest with the same crushing weight, but the future frightened her far more. Henry was everywhere and nowhere all at once. He did not speak of the assembly or of Frederick Weston, yet his presence wrapped around her like a steady hand at her back. He found reasons to appear where she was, in the library when she read, in the morning room when she took her tea, in the gardens when she walked to clear her thoughts. Each time their eyes met for a moment too long, each time something unspoken tightened between them. Eleanor told herself it was gratitude, gratitude for his defense, gratitude for the safety he offered. But her heart refused to listen. One afternoon, as she sat sketching poorly near the rose garden, Henry approached with papers tucked under his arm. He stopped when he saw her, watching her struggle to capture the curve of a petal. "You are holding the pencil too tightly," he said quietly. She looked up in surprise. "I beg your pardon." "You hold it as though it might run away," he said, then seemed to realize he had spoken too freely. His jaw tightened, that familiar sign of restraint. "Forgive me, I did not mean to intrude." But Eleanor smiled, small and uncertain. "You are not intruding." He hesitated, then moved closer, pointing to her page, his hand hovering just above hers. "Like this," he said, guiding her fingers gently. His touch was light, careful, but Eleanor felt it everywhere. When he withdrew, she could not tell if the warmth in her chest was embarrassment, or something far more dangerous. That night she dreamed of rain and glass, and hands that steadied her when she fell. The next morning brought a letter. Harriet Weston requested a private visit. Eleanor read the note twice, her fingers cold. She considered refusing, but some quiet instinct told her this was unfinished business she could no longer avoid. She agreed to receive her. Harriet arrived alone, dressed plainly but expensively, her posture rigid with a kind of practiced endurance. When they sat across from one another, silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. "I will not pretend this is a friendly call," Harriet said at last. "Nor will I insult you by lying." Eleanor inclined her head, waiting. "I know what my husband is," Harriet continued, her mouth tightening. "I knew it before I married him. I believed I could control it." Her laugh was short and bitter. I was wrong. She spoke then of Frederick's bitterness, of his growing resentment since the assembly, of how he spoke Eleanor's name with regret sharpened into blame. Harriet did not ask for pity, but Eleanor felt it rise unbidden. "You escaped him," Harriet said finally. "Do not waste that freedom." When she left, Eleanor sat alone for a long time, staring at the empty chair. For the first time she understood that Frederick Weston no longer held power over her, not even in memory. That evening Henry found her in the conservatory again. The rain had returned, drumming softly against the glass above them. "I heard Lady Weston called today," he said carefully. Eleanor nodded. She wished to speak of the past. His expression darkened, but he did not press. Instead he said, "You need never face such things alone again." The words were simple, but they struck deep. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, and wondered how she had ever believed him cold. Days turned into weeks. Autumn crept into the grounds, painting the trees with fire and gold. Eleanor began to feel at home in Ashford Hall, in a way that surprised her. The staff no longer watched her with uncertainty, the halls no longer echoed with her fear. Henry changed too, though subtly. He laughed more easily in her presence. He spoke more, though still with care. He brought her books without explanation. Once she found white camellias placed quietly in her sitting room, their scent wrapping around her with memories of her mother. She went to him immediately. "I know these flowers," she said softly. His shoulders stiffened. "You mentioned once they were meaningful to you." "That you remembered," she said, her voice unsteady, "means more than I can say." He looked away, uncomfortable, but his ears reddened. "It seemed practical," he muttered. She smiled, knowing now that this was his language of feeling. The storm broke one night without warning. Thunder shook the windows, lightning tearing the sky apart. Eleanor woke with her heart racing, the echoes of old fear rising in her chest. Without thinking, she wrapped herself in a shawl and went to the conservatory. Henry was already there. He stood among the shadows, his face lit by flashes of lightning, something raw and unguarded in his expression. For a moment, neither spoke. "I tried to keep this marriage what it was meant to be," he said finally, "an arrangement, safe, contained." Eleanor's breath caught. "I failed," he continued, his voice rough. "I do not know when it happened, only that I cannot undo it." The words hung between them, fragile and dangerous. "I was taught that love makes a man weak," he said. "I believed it for many years." Eleanor stepped closer. "And now?" "And now," he said quietly, "I am afraid." Her heart twisted painfully at the honesty in his voice. She reached for his hand, hesitating only a moment before placing her fingers over his scarred knuckles. "I am afraid, too," she whispered. "But I am more afraid of silence." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, as if seeing her not as a duchess or a duty, but as a woman standing bare before him. Thunder rolled overhead, rain lashed the glass, and something inside Eleanor finally gave way. "I loved you before I meant to," she said, "before I allowed myself to understand it." Henry drew a sharp breath. "Eleanor, I made a promise once," she continued, "that I would never love again. I was wrong." The words shattered the careful distance between them. He crossed the space in 2 strides, stopping only inches away, his hands trembling at his sides. "If I touch you now," he said, his voice barely steady, "there will be no returning to what we were." Eleanor lifted her chin, her heart pounding. "I do not wish to return." He kissed her then, slow and reverent, as if she were something sacred. The storm raged around them, but inside the conservatory there was only warmth and breath, and the steady truth of what they had become. When they finally parted, stars were breaking through the clouds. Henry rested his forehead against hers. "I will never insult your honor," he said fiercely. "Not with words, not with silence, not ever." Eleanor smiled through tears. "I know." But even as love claimed its place between them, the world beyond Ashford Hall had not finished testing them. The past, wounded and bitter, still watched from the shadows, and Eleanor sensed that what lay ahead would demand courage she was only just beginning to find. After the storm in the conservatory, nothing returned to what it had been before. Eleanor felt it from the moment she woke the next morning, the air lighter, the world sharper, as though some invisible veil had been lifted from her eyes. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the distant sounds of Ashford Hall coming to life, her heart full and unsteady. For the first time since her girlhood, she did not wake with dread. Henry did not appear at breakfast. The absence unsettled her more than she expected. She reminded herself that he was a man of habits formed over years of solitude, that one night of honesty did not erase a lifetime of restraint. Still, the silence pressed on her nerves until she could no longer sit idle. She found him in the east study, standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid, as if holding himself together by sheer force of will. He turned when he sensed her presence, his expression unreadable. "I was unsure how you would wish to proceed," he said quietly. Eleanor stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "I would wish you not to disappear." Something loosened in his face, just slightly. "I have never been skilled at this," he admitted, "at knowing what to do once the walls fall." She moved closer, stopping within arm's reach. "Then we will learn together." He studied her as if memorizing every line of her face, then nodded once, a decisive motion. "Very well." The days that followed were not without awkwardness, but they were honest. Henry no longer hid behind formality when they were alone. Eleanor no longer pretended her heart was untouched. They spoke carefully at first, then more freely, sharing fragments of themselves that had been kept locked away for years. Henry told her of his childhood, before loss hardened his father, of summers spent riding through open fields, of laughter that had once come easily. Eleanor told him of her mother, of quiet evenings reading by lamplight, of the girl she had been before Frederick Weston taught her shame. Each confession bound them closer. The test came sooner than Eleanor expected. A letter arrived from Frederick Weston requesting an audience with the Duke of Ashford. The words were polite, the intent unmistakable. Frederick had not accepted defeat. Eleanor read the letter with steady hands, then brought it to Henry without hesitation. He read it once, his jaw tightening. "He has no right," Eleanor said softly. "No," Henry agreed, "but he believes he does." They decided together to receive him. Not privately, but in the great drawing room, with witnesses nearby. Eleanor refused to hide. Frederick arrived with false confidence, his charm strained and brittle. He bowed too deeply, smiled too easily, and spoke as if the past were a misunderstanding rather than a wound. "I wished only to congratulate you," he said to Eleanor. "You have done remarkably well for yourself." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "I have done well because I learned to see my own worth, something you never did." The word struck harder than any slap. Frederick flushed, anger bleeding through his polished exterior. Henry stepped forward then, his voice calm and final. "You are no longer welcome in my home. You will leave now." Frederick laughed sharply. "You speak boldly for a man who married for convenience." Henry did not raise his voice. "I married a woman of strength and honor. You would not recognize either if they stood before you." Frederick's eyes flicked to Eleanor, searching for doubt, for weakness. He found none. He left without another word. When the door closed behind him, Eleanor felt something settle inside her. A long chapter finally ended. That night she stood beside Henry at the window of their shared sitting room, watching the moon rise over the grounds. He took her hand, not hesitantly now but with quiet certainty. "You will never face him again," he said. "Nor anyone who thinks to diminish you." Eleanor leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I believe you." Winter passed gently, softened by laughter and shared warmth. Ashford Hall changed under Eleanor's care, becoming not just a seat of power, but a home. The staff smiled more easily. Lady Augusta watched with sharp satisfaction, declaring often that she had always known this marriage would not remain an arrangement. Spring arrived with white camellias blooming across the estate. On a clear morning filled with birdsong, Henry led Eleanor back to the conservatory. Sunlight poured through the glass, turning the leaves bright and alive. "This is where everything changed," Eleanor said. Henry nodded. "And where I nearly lost the courage to speak." He took both her hands in his expression serious. "I once promised you respect and protection. I would give you more now, if you will accept it." She looked at him, heart full and steady. "You already have." They renewed their vows privately, not out of duty but choice. Words spoken freely, hands joined without fear. No witnesses but the light and the growing things around them. Years later, Eleanor would stand at a very different window, watching her children play on the lawn below. Henry's arm would rest around her waist, solid and warm, his presence a quiet constant. She would think sometimes of the girl she had been, standing in the rain, believing herself unworthy of love. And she would know with absolute certainty that the wound she once carried had not broken her, but led her home. For Eleanor Ashworth had learned that honor, once defended, could never be taken again, and love, when chosen freely, could turn even the coldest fortress into shelter. And in the end, that was the truest victory of all.